Today we're talking about the Pareto Principle, otherwise known as the 80-20 rule.
Then we'll touch on an interesting social media study that relates to the 80-20 rule.
We'll finish up by talking about Richard Koch's 3 mindset shifts for implementation of the 80-20 principle. Okay. Welcome back. I'm Jeff.
I'm Troy.
And like we said, we're going to talk about the 80-20 principle. So we better start by just kind of defining what is the 80-20 principle.
And a lot of people have heard it referred to as the Pareto Principle because an Italian researcher with the name of Pareto was the one that found this pattern of relationships through a lot of different areas. He was looking economically, but found it applied to a lot of different areas.
Yeah, so the principle is that 20% of our actions lead to 80% of results, and vice versa. 80% of our actions only lead to 20% of the results in our lives.
And it applies even more broadly. That's what we're going to kind of focus on. But they also note that generally speaking, and of course the percentages aren't exact, but 80% of the wealth is owned by 20% of people, or 80% of errors are caused by 20% of inputs, or so it really just relates to this disproportionality between the impact that certain things have relative to their input.
Yeah. So the interesting study you cited was from the University of Kentucky, and they found that there was not a change in daily well-being when people went off social media for 1, 2, 3, or even 4 weeks. That kind of goes against what we would say the 80-20 principle is, because I think a lot of times most people would say that time spent on social media is part of that 80% that only leads to 20% of benefits.
Right, and exactly what the implications are, we don't know, but part of what made it interesting is that we do have some biases where we expect a disproportionate impact, and it may or may not manifest. So the 80-20 principle emphasizes the importance of making sure that we don't just guess at what's going to have those outside impacts, but we really evaluate and make sure that that the 20% that we think we're going to be generating the 80% of changes actually does.
Yeah, Richard Koch, who literally wrote the book on the 80-20 principle, his whole thing is really kind of a scientific study of the inputs and outputs of our lives. So what do we spend our time doing, and what are the outputs of those things? And then going back and systematically kind of determining what the 20% is that gets 80% and vice versa.
Yeah, and I think that it is I really enjoyed reading the book because it's an opportunity to find more power than we maybe think we have. Life is so overwhelming. I mean, it can be so busy. It just feels like we're constantly in this churn mode, and stepping back and saying, okay, but what really is driving my life forward? What really is making me happy? What really is creating more productivity? It's a great invitation, and I think that some of the stuff that we'll talk about in terms of his 3 frameworks or his 3 mindset shifts emphasize why this is it's a really cool idea.
Yeah.
And again, the thing that's surprising about it, and in the book 80-20, he emphasizes how wide-ranging this relationship is. But it's really I guess for me, it just feels super empowering to say, wait, if I don't have to do it all, if I can identify those things that are really going to move things forward for me.
Yeah, so I'd be interested to get your thoughts. I just finished a book called Sapiens, and at the end he talks about happiness as kind of the goal of life, and how we've gone back in history and tried to study the happiness of historical figures as well as modern day happiness. And he says it's really hard because the way happiness works in our bodies is it's just chemicals being released. And the things that cause those chemicals to release, we don't have a great grasp of. But he talks about specifically marriage, that married people tend to be happier than those who aren't married. But then he kind of takes a step back and he says, okay, but that's correlation, not causation. Is it possible that happier people tend to be the ones who get married because they make more attractive spouses and stuff. So how do we take this 80-20 principle and really make sure that we're finding more of the causation and not the correlation that drives a lot of that
Well,
stuff?
and looking historically, I'd say 20% that caused 80% of the happiness historically was like not getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. I mean,
Absolutely.
some of it was probably a little easier to, to pinpoint, having enough food, or not getting the bubonic plague, Now it's there's no question that there's an added complexity to it. And I don't have the, the end all answer, but I think what Mr. or Dr. Koch recommends is that we just be more aware of, more mindful, more curious about what really does move the needle for us. And that really can happen either direction.
Yeah.
I think though that the study that you were talking about is interesting because it was there was an expectation
Totally.
that didn't prove out. That's great. I mean, that's what we want to do in our life is we want to test a hypothesis. And if it's proven right, and that's a 20% type of activity or 20% type of avoidance, fantastic. Move that forward. But at the same time, if it isn't, okay, what are we going to kind of evaluate or test next?
Yeah. I think that that's the real point I'm driving to is we don't know exactly what causes certain things. And that's where I think we talked about wellness a few weeks ago. And I think that's where a lot of that gets into trouble is they say, oh, this worked for me, so it's a global application.
For sure. Yeah.
And
again, correlation, maybe not causation.
Yeah.
So, so often we see correlation. We see something happen, especially if it's in another person. Oh, this worked for Johnny or, Susie or whatever. It must work for everybody.
Yeah.
And, it just ends up being a lot more complex than that. And so we just have to have some level of humility to say, one, we're going to test. We're not going to accept the status quo. We're going to test, but also we might find things that are surprising to us.
Yeah, no question. I think that's a lot of the get-rich-quick schemes that I think the people who are peddling those, it's worked for them. But
by and large.
But when it doesn't work for someone else, they get all bent out of shape. And it could be timing. It could be
just
any
the work.
number of things. Yeah.
It is one other interesting element in 80-20. They talk about sort of a associated or a similar study that was done with some of the early networking opportunities, just email and whatnot, and this ability to connect with more people. And it was funded by, he didn't note the companies, but folks that were in that computer realm. And their expectation was that this widening of our network of relationships would be causing positivity, that would have a positive impact on well-being. And they found the opposite, and so that was kind of one of those surprises that hey, it isn't creating it. Now the Kentucky study shows the opposite, that but omitting it doesn't necessarily
do anything either.
It doesn't necessarily do wonders, at least within the window of the study that they said. So again, just re-emphasizing the point that there's value in really evaluating and testing and trying to find what that 20% is, even if we don't find it at first. Even if we get it wrong at first. Boy, that's just such a valuable mindset as we're developing strategies for our life, is let's evaluate if something is extra useful for us.
Yeah, so speaking of mindset, let's talk about Koch's 3 mindsets. So the first one is major improvements are always possible.
And this is a really cool idea that ties to that 80-20 principle, obviously. But the idea is that we have these levers. The notion of a lever is that it's positioned so that you get an outside outsized amount of power from an undersized amount of effort. Well, if we view that 80-20 principle as kind of the lever in our lives, all we have to do to make big movements forward is find that 20%. We just have to find the lever in our life, or the levers in our life, that really create those outsized improvements or progress or fulfillment. And once we do, and we exert more and more energy and time and force on those levers, I agree. I mean, I think it's almost self-evident that we will see those outsized improvements. So that's really cool.
Yeah. Well, and from a mathematical standpoint, it's really interesting. If you say 20% of my time is getting 80% of my results, so if I can focus 100% of my time on those 20% of things that are getting those results, as soon as you put 100% of time in, now there is a new 80-20 split.
Yeah.
Where 20% of that new
of the what's 20% left now. Yeah.
is doing more than the remaining 80. And so mathematically, you can just keep refining, and make those major improvements. If you're saying I'm making an 80% improvement every time I make a major life change, I mean,
that's big.
That's a lot of progress.
Well, and to be clear, in theory, it sounds awesome, and totally acknowledge, as we're talking about this and thinking about it, that there are constraints. That other 80% often is, much of it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
But the real key is, again, your energy and your interest and what you're really focused on, driving as much as you can towards that 20%. Great. So, maybe you don't get that full 20% mathematical explosion. That's okay. If we even move that a little bit and are really pressing on the right lever, we still will move the boulders of our lives. It's still really cool. So
I
love the framework or the mindset that he
I think the idea that major improvements are always possible. You may not hit those 100% of the time, or even the majority of the time, but anytime you can hit those, just celebrate them, which kind of goes into his next one, which is it's our duty to enjoy life.
It's such a great point that we have so many things that we feel duty bound to do. I mean, whether it's work or exercise or whatever it might be, there's so much that we feel like we have to be doing, and the sort of the permission to say no, take a step back, and hey, what you're ultimately trying to, the purpose of all of those other things really should be our happiness and the happiness of those that that are meaningful to us and that are around us. So it's a great reminder that this 80-20 principle, sure, it's easy to apply it maybe to a job or a career, or business, but the overarching purpose ought to be what enhances happiness, what lifts happiness.
Yeah, and I think even in your career, that's one of the points that he makes, kind of, is shifting your focus away from things that you don't enjoy and you're not good at to things that you do enjoy and are good at, because happy workers are productive workers.
Absolutely.
And maybe vice versa, as we kind of discussed earlier. Maybe it's productive workers are happy workers.
Right.
But, there is certainly a synergy of the more productive you can feel, the more fulfilled, the happier you do end up feeling, which is amazing.
And I think that, again, kind of getting back to his point, is making it somewhat duty bound.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not the most pleasant word, I think, from a lot of us. But if we do feel like, hey, maybe there's a little added pressure, a little stick to go with the carrot, so to speak, that we do have a responsibility to find those 20% for us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what makes us us. It's what makes us unique.
Yeah.
And feeling a little bit maybe more duty or more pressure to do that, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah,
so I
it
like
kind of makes it, don't feel guilty for working less and taking more time for enjoyment.
Yeah.
He's a huge proponent of work for yourself, and I think him and Tim Ferriss would probably get along pretty well.
They overlap a lot. Yeah.
So his last one is time is abundant. There's no shortage of time. And I think that this is something that we get so, especially in the self-improvement, wellness, kind of health space.
Yeah.
A lot of people are saying time is your only finite resource, and there's a real scarcity mentality around time. But this was kind of something that for me opened up my eyes a little bit, and just like, yeah, time is limited. We shouldn't waste it. But at the same time, we have a lot of time. Like there's a lot of things that we're wasting time on that we can, there's plenty of time out there.
Well, we've talked before a little bit about this notion of 168 hours.
Yeah, Laura Vanderkam.
Laura Vanderkam, love it. And when we really deconstruct what sort of the non-negotiables in our lives, when our lives are, so 8 hours of sleep, we ought to get it to be productive and all that type of thing. So that 56 hours sort of comes off the ledger, and then we may have work that we just have to do for the time being, and that's another 8 hours, 5 times, so there's another 40 and when we're really careful and kind of go through that balance sheet of our time, caramba, for me anyway, it makes me feel a little bit foolish that I feel so busy,
totally,
but can't really provide a great accounting. My time CPA, my time accountant would say, boy, Troy, there's some holes in your profit and loss statement as it relates to use of time. So absolutely, this is one of the things that I've really realized and felt over the past couple of years that we've been working through a lot of this stuff, is if I'm blaming it on not enough time, what I'm saying is it's either not important enough or I'm doing stuff that
ought not to be doing.
Yeah, at least as it relates to this thing that I'm
Totally.
saying I don't have time for. You know what I mean? So
yeah, I think it works out to like 72 hours after 8 hours of sleep a night and a full 40-hour work week. And obviously you have meals and
some other obligations.
But when we say 72 hours, that's almost 2 additional full work weeks that we have on top of our already existing work day. So.
And they're just, it's easy to kind of joke about it, and it is a little funny to hear certain people saying, oh, I'm so busy. And then you kind of go, what are you doing exactly? And,
Totally.
the excuse falls apart pretty quickly. But what's really important is the empowerment. Again, use that term a couple times, is the empowerment that comes from just that mindset of saying, no, I've got an abundance of time. This notion of he says the idea that time is abundant. Start there.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people hear this and even read Laura Vanderkam's book, and they feel immediately like this guilt, or kind of this dread, like, wow, I suck. I'm wasting so much time.
Right.
And that's totally natural.
Oh, that's not what I'm supposed to feel.
But I think that definitely flipping that on its head and saying, okay, 72 hours, I didn't do great this week. How can I do better next week? And man, I have a lot of time that I can put towards a hobby, a project that I'm passionate about, whatever.
And the great thing, as we've talked about before, is my life starts right now. Regardless of what I did last week, last year, a decade ago, I'm starting the book of my life, chapter 1, right now. Every day, every moment, really, we're doing the same thing. So, I may have sucked. I may not have been very good at using my time wisely last week.
Totally.
That doesn't predict my future. That doesn't require that I'm not going to be better moving forward. So just replacing the mindset of I'm so busy with time is abundant and framing my forward, that planning that I'm doing forward. Yeah. It should bring hope. Sure, it might bring regret. It might even bring a little bit of guilt when we look at it in the rearview mirror. Yeah. But the 168 hours is always in front of me.
Totally.
You know what I mean? I always have that I can improve in and find those 20% wins that really amplify, my happiness in life. So it should be really hopeful.
Yeah, it goes a little bit back to nostalgia. Where if you're looking back and focusing only on the negative, you get nostalgic depression.
Right.
If you look back and focus on kind of the positive, it's actually a great tool for hope.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
That's the key, I think, is how we spin all of these, these ideas. They can be depressing or they can be empowering.
Yeah.
So make it empowering.
Yes. Room for improvement's always empowering.
For sure.
So we all have our 20s that we can focus on. We hope that something in this episode today has been empowering for you. We've loved talking about it. Love reading the book. So.
It's a great book. It's an interesting read. He's very engaging, and the way that he talks about it makes it, or at least for me, made it pretty easy to walk away saying, yeah, I can get better. I can find my 20s, not feeling like, boy, what a loser I am. So I always like books that make me feel ready to attack the world, attack my 168 hours as opposed to feeling like, oh, I blew it again. So it's a good book.
Yeah. We're so grateful for our listeners who make this all possible. If you want to continue to join us on this journey of finding our 20s, then please subscribe or send it to a friend. Anything you can do helps us keep this podcast going. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one.